Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. The US and Israel have launched a massive assault on Iran. Benjamin Netanyahu has said the strikes will increase over the coming days. Donald Trump has said that they figured it would be about 4 weeks or so when asked about a potential timeline. Iran has retaliated, unleashing its own strikes on US military bases, Israel and other targets across the Middle East. The killing of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and many of his senior commanders has left Tehran's future leadership in question. But questions are also swirling about the legality of the strikes. Today on the front page, Waikato University international law professor Al Gillespie is with us to discuss how we got here and where to next. So Al, first off, give us a little background. How did we get here? Why is this happening?
The animosity between Iran and the West is very long-standing, and the undue influence of the West in Iran goes back to the 20th century. But in the 21st century, and especially since the revolution in 1979, it's become much more difficult. And the main cause is their race for a nuclear weapon, which they began at the beginning of the 21st century.
So why is it ramped up all of a sudden now?
There's a lot of opportunity of why you'd want to strike now. There are significant protests. They are weak in terms of the region with the proxies that they support, and they are a repugnant regime in terms of their human rights record. The problem is that this doesn't give you authority under international law to strike another country. But the chance is the best it's been for many years if you were trying to topple the regime.
Well, from the perspective of international law, what is the most significant thing that stands out to you in terms of this strike?
Without Security Council approval, there is nothing in the UN Charter that says you can bomb someone who refuses to negotiate with you. And so this is, in theory, an illegal action. It's very similar to 2003 with the intervention into Iraq, which was also viewed as an illegal action. The problem is that there's a very big gap between theory and practice. And so even though in theory it might be illegal, in practice there'll be no repercussions. But the legality question is also important domestically for Mr. Trump, because he has gone around the authority of Congress to do this military strike. And in theory, their constitution says that for offensive actions of war, as opposed to defensive, you should get the authority of Congress. Otherwise, the president has too much power.
Right, so that echoes kind of what Helen Clark has said as well. She's called our government's response a disgrace, and she posted online about knowing full well that international law has been breached. Had they any legitimate claim to invoking a right of self-defence? And B, all this chat about self-defence, is that a loophole or something in international law to allow you to strike another state?
First off, the UN Charter works on the assumption that every country has the right to self-defence without having to get Security Council approval. But it must be preemptive, or it must be in a situation where you're either struck or that there's no alternative to defending yourself. And so the question is here, was there an alternative? Was there an imminent strike upon America about to happen, or Israel? And the answer is that's very unlikely. And that's because their nuclear capability had been damaged recently with the American strikes, and also over the relationship that they've had with the international community trying to curtail their build-up. And so there was no imminent risk that I can see. And so even in theory that you've got a preemptive right to self-defence, you wouldn't have qualified for that. This is much more of an offensive action where they refuse to negotiate consistently. To be fair, that they are difficult negotiators and that they do play cat and mouse with the international community, and they've done it for decades. And Mr. Trump is someone who doesn't have a great regard for international law, and he's now brought the issue to a head.
Well, he has said that Iran's leadership waited too long to talk. Luxon and Peters have said that New Zealand has consistently condemned Iran's nuclear program and the repression of its people. They've called for the resumption of negotiations and adherence to international law. How likely is it, though, that the new Iranian leadership is to seek out these negotiations now?
Starting a war is very easy. Ending a war is much more difficult. And trying to build a new regime is just conjecture at the moment. We don't know how they will respond with the death of the Ayatollah. We don't know who a potential alternative leader could be. We don't know what their system of government could be. And whether it will be a peaceful transition, I very much doubt. It's potentially quite likely to turn into a civil war. in which any future leadership will be contested. And then in an ideal world, they would say, okay, fair cop, we're now going to change regime. We're a democracy, we're a republic, and we'll negotiate. In reality, you've got 90 million people that do a deeply religious regime, and at least a quarter of these people are going to contest and potentially fight very hard against their loss of power. And so if you can achieve regime change just from bombing them, I would be amazed. You're very likely going to need boots on the ground to actually try to effect this change. And then you look at all the history, you look at recent Afghanistan, look at Libya, look at Syria, look at Iraq, and everyone's a failure. And now we're about to try to multiply that on a bigger scale.
And given that all attempts of the West for regime changes have been failures in the past, I noted that Vice President J.D. Vance and the Defense Secretary there in the US, Pete Hegseth, they both were pretty careful to publicly state that their goal is not a regime change. They said, we are not at war with Iran, we're at war with Iran's nuclear program at one point. I think that was at the weekend. But then Trump, on the other hand, has completely contradicted them. He's posted on social media, and I quote, "If the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change? MIGA, M-I-G-A, make Iran great again." Now, is it important legally, I suppose, to differentiate between pushing for a regime change versus we think that they have the nuclear weapons, hence this is what we're doing?
It's important ethically, because it's one thing, everyone gets the idea that Iran shouldn't have a nuclear weapon, and that's correct. They shouldn't have a nuclear weapon. And it gives it a veneer of support to say we're trying to stop the nuclear weapon. People can understand that.
But well, that's taken straight out of the 2003 playbook, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, the similarities between 2003 and 2026 are quite striking, because both are concerned about weapons of mass destruction. Both have a process of negotiation that's ongoing. The difference between 2003 and now is that there was more UN involvement in 2003 than there is now. But both end badly, and when you get the intervention. But once you've got the intervention, it's easy to intervene or to strike. The hard part is trying to build a regime afterwards. Think about Afghanistan, where you go in there, you try to topple the Taliban, and it takes you 20 years of warfare, and you fail, and you end up coming out with your tail between your legs. That type of situation could be multiplied here. But it's not just about the regime change. It's about the humanitarian conflict that will follow, and for the West, the surge of refugees. The last thing Europe wants right now is millions more people coming towards its border. But that is potentially what you're looking at if a civil war breaks out, and that is quite possible.
And that's perhaps as well. I mean, in 2003, the United States and George Bush had more allies on board also. I'm thinking about Tony Blair in the UK, for example. But now they do seem to be quite alone in this battle, and also with Israel as well. What do you make of the other countries around the world, their reaction to this?
So far, the other countries in the region are showing restraint, because Iran is lashing out, sending out missiles left, right, and center. And the one thing that the Middle East all shares in common is a very deep memory, and they all have a lot of remembrances of violations against their sovereignty and against acts of transgression that Iran has done. Iran has been a bad neighbor to a lot of these countries for many decades. But so far, America and Israel have stopped the other countries from striking back. But I think there'll be a fair chance that some of these countries will want to go in and have a little bit of quid pro quo for some of the former actions that Iran has done against them. But so far, it's under control, but they have not intervened. But I wouldn't be surprised if Iran keeps sending missiles towards some of these countries, that they too don't want to join in giving them a thumping.
Yeah, one of the first reactions that I was seeking out was from Saudi Arabia, but they've been quite quiet off the offset, haven't they?
Partly it's self-interest to be quiet, but partly it's also a question about waiting. And the challenge will be, if it turns to a civil conflict, the intervention in Iran to try to get a regime that they want, because none of them are above meddling in each other's domestic politics. But throughout the region, and you could see this with the rise of Islamic State, extremism and humanitarian catastrophe go hand in hand in that part of the world. This is the easy part of the equation. Going in there, starting the bombing, a lot of high-tech visuals. This is easy. The hard part is what happens next, who you negotiate with, and how you build a stable Iran.
And how do you see that happening from here on out?
I think at the moment this is a remarkable distraction, and I think it will take a few weeks of bombing, maybe up to 4, until you've got a complete superiority of American and Israeli Air Force over the region. But the problem you've got is that this will not break the spirit of the Republican Guard or the Revolutionary Guard. That these people will continue to fight, but they will wait for the opportunity for American boots or Israeli boots to be on the ground and take the fight to them. They can't win superior in the technology war right now. But if they're drawn into the country, they have got a chance of a long conflict that could be drawn out. All of the regions in this part of the world are experts at that type of warfare.
They have waged war against civilization itself. Our resolve, and likewise that of Israel, has never been stronger. America is now again the richest, most powerful nation in the world by far. But the only reason we enjoy the quality of life that we do and the freedom and security is we have done things that others are unable to do. But it's because of warriors who are willing to lay down their lives to do battle with our enemies. And they do battle better than anybody.
For months, they say that the Israeli and American intelligence agencies had been secretly watching the supreme leader in Iran. Why might that moment, or the right moment, be now for them?
There's various things that they could be negotiating for, and there's not much transparency over what was going on. But the first one is the removal of a nuclear potential. The second one is the removal of ballistic missiles. The third one is control of the proxies in the region, and the fourth one is the right to protest. The right to protest is what seems to have been the catalytic event in recent times because of the repression of those who have tried to express their dissent against the regime. There was a heavy-handed response. It seems to have been tempered, but then what happened is now it has suddenly sparked up again. And Mr. Trump is hoping that the people in Iran will rise up and take control of their own destiny. The challenge you've got is that those who want the theocratic regime will fight very hard against that. In terms of the timing, and two considerations here, is you're seeing a lack of good faith on the part of negotiators from America. First off, you should not strike while you're negotiating. And second off, you should not strike the leaders. Because if you strike the leaders, you break all good faith between countries. And you can expect now that as much as their supreme leader has been killed, they will try to do the same to Mr. Trump.
I mean, surely, I know that along with the Ayatollah, there was a lot of his senior commanders that have been reportedly killed as well. But when we see, in history and going back to 2003, Saddam Hussein, wouldn't there be just someone else waiting in the wings for these kind of regimes?
People assume that this is like Venezuela, where you can go in and you can cut the head off the snake. But this is not one head and one snake. This is an entire ecosystem. And the ecosystem is not just based around power, it's based around religion. And wars around religion are the worst type of conflicts you can get into because people will fight to the death over what they think is most important to them theologically. And so this regime will fill the spaces and they will wait patiently until it's their time to strike. And it may be that they will get degraded in terms of their ballistic missiles, but then they will wait for people to come on the ground and they will reply. That reply will not just be against external enemies, it will be against internal enemies as well. And so all of those who are currently expressing dissent against the regime are at extreme risk. If you see that extreme risk, if you see the regime cracking down even harder on protesters and those who express delight at the Ayatollah being killed, then and you see more blood on the streets, the pressure for America to get involved and put boots on the ground and to stop that will become very high. Even though Mr. Trump is now in the exact opposite position of where he started out being, trying to stop foreign wars, he's now on the cusp of throwing America into an even bigger one.
Well, it's interesting as well. I read this piece, sorry to bring it back to the comparisons with 2003, but the narrative on even getting the American public on board with these strikes is incredibly similar. You've got a similar narrative, like a rogue regime, a secretive kind of sect, a looming nuclear threat. You've got a ticking clock, it has to happen now. And then what you saw with 2003 is that, Dick Cheney out there saying, there will be, parades in the streets when American soldiers, when their boots get on the ground. But it did actually nearly, bring the country into an all-out civil war. What do you think we have or haven't learned from 2003 to now?
I think we've forgotten everything. And I think our memories are remarkably short. And you've got the first off, it doesn't begin in 2003. It begins in 2001 with the intervention into Afghanistan. And that's a 20-year operation. You change the regime, that it unifies the people against the invaders. And eventually you are pushed out the other side. You get to 2003 and you go into Iraq. And the result of Iraq wasn't the change in regime. It was the rise of Islamic State and extremists who tried to fill the void. Or then you go into Libya and you end up with a broken and chaotic country in the aftermath. Or you try to get involved in Syria and you have a humanitarian catastrophe, which leads to the biggest refugee surges that we've seen towards the West. And I think I am dumbfounded that no one is saying, why are any of these four examples good? Then they're all failures. And yet that's exactly where we're going to right now. But to start the war is easy. To finish it, that this could take years.
Well, what tools realistically does the UN Security Council actually have at this point? Because they're quite constrained given one of their key parties is a permanent member with a veto.
The good news about this conflict is that Russia and China will not get involved. And they are not allies of Iran. So despite this being very scary, this is not the Third World War. And that's excellent news. The problem you've got, though, is that both Russia and China learn by experience and by the precedents of other countries. And so you already see Russia in Ukraine, and heaven forbid, China will be thinking, what would happen if we now acted without Security Council approval and took Taiwan? And so everyone can see the problem of a lawless world. It's okay when it's effectively our team, but what happens when it's the other team? And they start acting in the same way. But the Security Council you might get to a point where the regime is crushed and you try to get some kind of legitimacy and some kind of stamp of approval from the Security Council. But that could be a very long time coming, because your best outcome is that you have a multilateral force that's based upon regional peacekeepers trying to rebuild Iran with the consent of the Iranian people. And the Iranian people have transparent democracy. They elect the government they want and select the constitution that they want. But if this is forced on them by anyone else, you will get a very negative reaction. And the Iranian regime is a particular theocratic flavor, which is antagonistic to a lot of similar religions in the region. And they will fight tooth and nail, as they did in 1979, to protect their power.
Let's be under no illusion, this was not a regime that New Zealand has supported or been in favour of for decades under successive governments. I mean, it's a regime that's brutally repressing its own people, murdering tens of thousands of people. It's one that's actually been arming armed proxies and terrorism all around the world. And, we've had years of diplomacy to try and manage the nuclear program and the ballistic missile program as well, and to no effect. So, we won't be mourning the loss of this leader.
Do you endorse the attacks?
Well, again, I understand why they're doing it, because they are obviously, making sure that Iran, which has been threatening a lot of peace and security in the world, is actually, that stops. And ultimately, it's up to the Iranian people now to determine what happens next and where it goes to.
And lastly, Al, do you think that New Zealand's response to this is a good one?
I think it's tepid. And I think that the current New Zealand approach is trying very hard not to offend Mr. Trump. But we know that this is not in accordance with the United Nations Charter. This is not in support of international law, and this will only lead to more instability. To call for more negotiation, to call for adherence to international humanitarian law and the rights of the Iranian people is correct. But this is another breach of the rules-based order. It doesn't make anyone safer.
Thanks for joining us, Al.
You're welcome, Chelsea.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is hosted and produced by me, Chelsea Daniels. Kane Dickey is our studio operator, Richard Martin, our producer and editor, and our executive producer is Jane Yee. Follow The Front Page on the iHeart app or wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time for another look beyond the headlines.